Um, so welcome to another in the series of Idea Collider. This is a book club podcast, and I'm delighted to have with us Peter Kolchinsky, who wrote, just a kind of wonderful book with a kind of remarkable forward-thinking idea about, almost an abstract view of our industry and what innovation looks like, and how we could be funding it and how we should be thinking about it. So, Peter, could you tell us, a little bit about you and your reasons for writing the book?
Sure. I'm a scientist by training, but I've been an investor my entire career. And I've had the privilege of working closely with a lot of biotechnology companies, really learning about their work trying to develop new drugs and medical devices and diagnostics. And I get to see the cutting edge of everything that's going on in the world to advance our medical standards of care. Including now, really seeing from the inside, the grand effort to beat back COVID.
Yeah, and just give us a
You
sense
know,
of
I,
your
yeah,
kind of.
sorry, I should mention I run a firm called RA Capital.
Mhm.
It's a large investment firm just focused on biotech. Um, we've got a team of about 80 people, a lot of PhDs on the team, and we really, have grown to be able to invest across a lot of public companies, a lot of private companies, and we've started even forming our own companies. And I should say that our job is not about sort of yelling buy, sell, or something like that. If you've seen some sort of Wolf of Wall Street type of movie, it's really more venture capital. It's spending a lot of time digging deep into the science and analyzing data and getting to know the people that are creating these new companies and developing these new products. And so we really see the human side of the effort to develop new medicines.
That's cool. And then how long ago were you a scientist, or and
Yeah,
how
well,
long
I
have you
feel like
been?
I'm a scientist every day.
Mhm.
So when you're steeped in the science, it never goes away. But I've been an investor now for over 18 years.
Yeah, and there was a point in the book when you covered the EpiPen where you kind of revealed a very deep and personal connection to the kind of ideas in the book. Would you want to share a little bit more about that?
Sure. So um, this book is really written from the standpoint of uh, not so much an investor responding to public outcry over affordability of medicines, but kind of an informed citizen and father, right? I have a deep appreciation for what medicines can do because I, like everybody else, am a patient. I have people I love who are patients who have, things that they worry about and need to be treated. I have children, I worry about their health. And my daughter has food allergies. And that means that my wife and I and our entire family are constantly worried that something might strike her down. Someone who's careless, leaves a trace of what she's allergic to in a food. We're constantly asking. The way that everybody, by the way, now is, wondering, can I let my kids hang out with those other kids? Asking other families, what's your
Right.
attitude towards social distancing? How careful have you been? That's what it's like for us whenever we order food, whenever we go to a restaurant, we read the labels of everything, right? So constant preparedness and awareness and anxiety. And now all of society feels that about COVID, right? They don't know when they're
Right.
going to catch it. And so to me, the EpiPen, is this lifesaver. We carry it around with us all the time, either the EpiPen or the AviQ, which arguably is a upgraded version of the EpiPen, in that it talks to you. Like the AviQ device will talk you through how to apply it, so that when my daughter was 3, she would go around to people and show them how to use the AviQ device, right? And so when the New York Times and other media outlets cover the EpiPen like it's some case of just egregious price jacking without really delving into the backstory, uh, and sort of taking for granted, like, well, epinephrine's an old drug. It's been around for 60 years. It's like, wait a second. It's been around as like a vial, and a separate syringe that, if you, I guess, if you like, you can carry around. But if your child is experiencing an anaphylactic event, you do not want to be rummaging around for a vial and a syringe and trying to fill that syringe and then apply it. You want an auto injector. So let's not kid ourselves. The EpiPen has not been around for 60 years. In its current form, it's been around for less. Now, granted, it's actually been around for, I think, at this point, a little over 30 years, though it's been upgraded over time and it wasn't always as reliable as it is now. But back in like 2007, before Mylan got their hands on the EpiPen, it was much less known. It was cheaper. It wasn't well marketed, and there was a company called Merck KGA that was happy to offload it along with a bunch of other drugs that they didn't care for. They were just looking to sell it because it wasn't a moneymaker, and they certainly weren't investing in promoting it. So Mylan picked it up in a basket of other drugs and generics that they acquired from Merck KGA. And they could have gone to one of two ways with it. They could have said, yeah, this really isn't worth it. Let's sort of sideline it. Or they could have made it worth their while to promote it. Well, you know how schools all know about allergies now and they all have the EpiPen. And there are even laws that allow a school to use Bobby's EpiPen to help Sally, even if she doesn't have an EpiPen. Those weren't all there before. That level of awareness wasn't there before. The world is safer now for my daughter because somebody fought for those reforms. Where do you think the money and the effort came from for those reforms? It came from the fact that the EpiPen was now worth promoting because Mylan raised the price to
Right.
make it worth their while. And so they lobbied for these changes. And so I would argue that the product is not epinephrine. The product is the EpiPen, an auto injector, with the entire awareness campaign that Mylan has pushed and the nonprofits that Mylan has helped support over the years have pushed to create the awareness and the know-how of how and when to use the EpiPen,
Hmm.
right? That is definitely not something the New York Times will tell you about, and that's a shame.
Yeah, and I really like that theme that came through the book of that kind of almost. It sounds contrarian, but actually the way that you lay it out for insulin not being the same as it used to be, for the product being more than the thing that gets injected, but the educational campaign, the awareness, the incremental improvements, as well as the original idea.
Yeah,
And someone's got to pay for that, which actually is the next sort of question, I
that's
guess, that
that's right.
the start from the end of the book, and your kind of manifesto, if you like, it was the way I kind of read it. So the biotech social contract. Could you maybe tell us what you see that
Yeah,
is, and what's the main message?
yeah. So, look, the book was really written in response to patients crying out, "I can't afford my medicines," and they've been crying out for years. And uh, our industry has lobby groups and it has people that I trusted as I was growing up in my career to answer those questions and respond to, senators and congresspeople when they would say, are you charging too much? I just figured that kind of lobbying and advocacy, that was somebody else's work. I'm going to focus on the science and, try and make sure that we're investing in the best companies that have the best shot at developing a drug, and we're doing God's work here, right? So somebody else will deal with all that messaging. But in middle of 2015, when Turing price jacked Daraprim, and Hillary Clinton tweeted about that and really sparked a firestorm, an appropriate one at that, by the way, over price jacking of old drugs. Um, you know, I thought, yeah, that's wrong. I invest in the development of new drugs, and I don't see any utility to society rewarding the price jacking of old drugs by actually paying those prices, right? So if Turing and Valiant were denied those prices for old drugs, that wouldn't do anything to deter me from wanting to invest in new ones. And I thought that the industry would make a case to the public and say, um, you know, it's wrong. That kind of price jacking is wrong, and it's terrible that people can't afford their drugs. And here is a holistic solution that we propose. And the industry didn't. You would hear patients cry out, "I can't afford drugs," and the industry would respond, "But drug development is expensive." And it was like, that's not the answer to the question. And I was reading the biography of Alexander Hamilton um, at the time, going on kick, reading about all the founding fathers and the founding of America. And I was really struck by how Alexander Hamilton really fought for the Constitution, as a social contract. And when it wasn't clear that the states would ratify the Constitution because they had objections to this or that, possible flaw, and they would say, "But what about this and what about that?" He buckled himself down and, together with Madison and Jay, wrote a lot of articles, addressing each of the objections that people had raised to explain what the merits were of this social contract, of the Constitution. And we remember those papers as the Federalist Papers. They're credited with making a difference, with swaying all the states to ratify the Constitution. So we have America in all of its grandeur and sadly all of its flaws, as it is today. And it's a living document. We keep amending it, and I hope we will continue to. But it wouldn't have been here if someone hadn't fought really hard and lobbied for it. And so I took my inspiration from that, and I thought, okay, I believe in something called the Biotech Social Contract. I didn't invent the term. The CEO of Allergan actually used it for the first time. Except he said the Biotech Social Contract is that we must not take more than like single-digit price increases on our drugs. So I felt like it was a really great term, but that can't actually be what the contract says. That's too little. It's not inspired enough. And so I appropriated the term, and I made the case that the Biotech Social Contract is that our industry should develop drugs that will go generic without undue delay. And society, in exchange, will make all those drugs, branded and generic, affordable to patients through proper insurance. That means everybody has to have insurance, and that insurance cannot charge excessive out-of-pocket costs, right? So we are building new drugs and collecting a finite mortgage on those drugs. We're getting paid for our work, and we have to hustle to invent something new before that mortgage expires. And that means that we keep applying this ingenuity, the creativity of the entire biomedical field, to upgrading human health, right? And we're constantly having to hustle to think of something new because those mortgages are constantly expiring as the patents expire. And America is getting great value from the branded drugs it pays for because it pays them off. Just like a family that pays off the mortgage on a home gets to now own that home and pass it on to their kids and their grandkids. And it means that generic drugs are a public good, right? That's worth America paying for, but it shouldn't pay for it by making the few people who are patients today pay for that innovation or disproportionately pay for it. Just like a town should not pay for its fire department by charging a high copay or deductible to families whose homes are on fire, right? Can you imagine if a fire truck rolled up to a burning house, demanded a copay, and if the family couldn't pay, they just let it burn? Yet that's exactly what the American so-called insurance system allows. Not for everybody. A lot of people have good insurance, particularly if they have jobs they can afford their out-of-pocket costs. But there is a very large number of people, probably say certainly the 15% or so of people without insurance, and then quite a few people, maybe under 5-10%, who are underinsured given the plans that they've got, that basically will be told by the doctor, the drug that you need is X, and here's your prescription. And the doctor might even need to get prior authorization from the insurance company to confirm that this drug is appropriate. And the insurance company will grant the prior authorization, say, yep, you're right, that is an appropriate drug, and still demand a high out-of-pocket cost that that patient can't afford. what are they trying to nudge that patient to do?
Right.
Disregard appropriate care?
Yep.
That's just not insurance. So the book basically says we got to fix this. We got to make sure that insurance is actually insurance. That's how America will pay for innovation. And let's make sure that everything that the industry creates really is something that the public can pay off and enjoy as a public good. And the reality is, not all drugs go generic. And that's a big part of what I ended up writing about and why I proposed a critical reform of that.
Yeah, and it's a really compelling point that you make. This kind of, the mortgage versus the rent. As you say, there's a lot of things that don't get cheaper, that don't get generic within the
That's right.
healthcare system.
Yeah, hospitals don't go generic. Surgery doesn't go generic. We're all paying rent, for those services. But a drug that keeps us out of the hospital and is temporarily expensive, but then goes generic and becomes, inexpensive for the rest of all time, while still keeping us out of the hospital. That's basically like you've gotten out from paying rent for an apartment by paying a mortgage on a home and then paying it off.
Right.
Right? And you've allowed your family then to live without that burden of rent. Your kids, your grandkids, you pass it on. Our parents paid off the mortgage on, a lot of drugs that we now enjoy as generics, and we don't even think about how they got here. Well, we need to. We need
Mm,
to appreciate that. We can't take it for granted.
mm. And that kind of variability that you described, the kind of step edits, the prior auths, the copay, I think you call out in the book, this is almost designed to disincentivize people from taking their medicines that they've been prescribed by an active, informed intermediary.
Yeah, I wouldn't say almost designed. It's absolutely
Right.
designed for that. And I find it pretty heartless. I don't actually think that any one person necessarily is harmless, but when people get together into a bureaucracy and each one follows a certain rule, the things that emerge out of that bureaucracy can sometimes be quite heartless. We saw that with COVID,
Mm,
right? We basically told everybody, if you think you might have symptoms, go in, get tested. And immediately, insurance companies start rejecting coverage for COVID testing and COVID admissions because that's what they do. They just reject, reject, reject.
right.
And, you start hearing about it in the press, and it's like, that's insane. How can the American response to a public health threat be to financially discourage people from doing what they're supposed to be doing? And, there was outcry. Insurance companies were pressured by governors and others into changing their ways, and they did. They changed. They fixed. They patched over their insurance plans for COVID related
Mm,
healthcare issues, whether it's admissions or tests. And the federal government vowed to pay the costs of hospital admissions for uninsured people.
mm,
Well, that's great. I mean, those are the reforms that we've long needed, except you got to recognize that cancer and diabetes and Parkinson's, those are, somebody's personal COVID crisis.
right.
Why is it that what makes sense for COVID doesn't make sense for, Parkinson's disease or cancer? I
Yeah.
think it does. Right. So I hope that these reforms that we've put in place for COVID, I hope that they're converted into permanent improvements to the American healthcare system.
Mm. And just to loop back to the social contract, the biotech social contract. So at the core of the proposal is, you pay what you need to for the new drug, and there's a defined point at which they become and are encouraged to become generics. And then open to price competition and so forth. So the idea is that you're reducing the variability there, right? Of certainty of competition, at which time they're paid for, the originator or the innovator has been paid back for their innovation.
Yeah. So this notion of drugs going generic, it's to us today, it feels rational, and certainly it's what I grew up believing is was always there, but it actually wasn't always there. Uh, you know, decades ago in the '60s, uh, drugs didn't go generic the way they do today. Your pharmacy could not just swap out an expensive branded drug with a bioequivalent generic in order to save you and the system money. Your doctor had to actually prescribe the very particular drug you were given, right? So um, there were many people that had to lobby, for change, and they successfully did that when we passed something called the Hatch-Waxman Act in 1984, that basically said uh, companies, can sell a branded drug, for a time, and then when the patents expire, other companies are going to be allowed to seek approval of their generic version of that drug, provided that it meets bioequivalent standards set by the FDA and can show that it's, essentially the same as the branded drug. And pharmacies then will be allowed to just swap out the branded drug you might be prescribed. So if your doctor writes Lipitor, the pharmacist can just say, "I know what you mean, and I basically have Lipitor, but I'm going to source it from this company over here that's willing to sell it for pennies." Right. And so the competition drives down the price. Um, and that created patent cliffs where companies all of a sudden saw their mortgage their mortgage stream end. And they had to hustle to invent something new in order to replace those revenues. And, I don't think that it's a coincidence that, the Hatch-Waxman Act, coincides with this tremendous surge in innovation, that we've had over the last several decades. It's certainly not, the only thing that caused it. I mean, you needed science to work, but this hustle that we see, where companies are constantly struggling to replace, the looming loss of revenues, I think it's really brought out the creativity and the drive in the sector. The trouble is that the Hatch-Waxman Act never really anticipated complex drugs, biologic drugs, things that are made in cells rather than chemicals that are synthesized in a laboratory. And it turns out that it's very hard to make a copy of a biologic drug, right? It's sort of the difference between mixing a cocktail, where you follow the recipe and you can pretty much, copy the recipe pretty reliably from bar to bar to bar, versus a wine, where all the conditions have to be exactly right, and even the same vineyard struggles to reproduce its own wine, right? And so biologics actually are produced like wine through fermentation. Cells, produce these proteins. And so the FDA could not certify that somebody else's biologic was interchangeable with, a given original brand. And so companies had to just create their own biologic. If you wanted to compete in the insulin space, you had to make your own insulin, right? And get it approved as a new drug. And so there is price competition among biologics, but it's sort of like there's price competition among iPhones versus Android phones. Somebody's got to actually create the whole product. There's no such thing as a perfect replica generic iPhone. So the idea, by the way, of all drugs being monopolies isn't quite right. There's plenty of competition in drug classes, but it means that a doctor has to decide which insulin to prescribe for you, and therefore insurance companies sort of say, "Look, I'm getting a really good deal on Humalog right now. I'd really like you to, try to focus on that one." And if the doctor doesn't want to do that, then that's what they use copays and step edits for, to sort of say, "Look, Jane, I'd really like you to think about using Humalog as your insulin and not Novolog." And as long as those drugs are pretty similar, then I don't see a huge problem with that. The trouble is that sometimes one particular biologic isn't right for the patient, and they do need the other one. And even though the insurance company is not getting a bargain on that one, hasn't negotiated a really great discount, I still don't think that it's appropriate for them to deny it to that patient for whom that drug is right. Whereas a true generic would just be a cheaper version of exactly the drug you need. So it's hard to do that with biologics. And what it means is that these biologic drugs are increasingly discovered to be ungenericizable. For example, Humira, a hugely successful drug for autoimmune disorders, particularly rheumatoid arthritis. AbbVie's been selling that for now 18 years, and it generates about $15 billion a year in revenues in the U.S. It's past its original patents. Most drugs go generic after 10 to 15 years. It's kind of like, as if the builder who built your house for you and that you've been paying mortgage payments to, and put out of your mind that technically you pay mortgage payments to a bank. Pretend it's a builder that's, financing the house with you and charging you mortgage payments. As you approach the 15-year mark when you thought you would pay off the mortgage, imagine if they said, well, actually, there's this clause here and you got to keep paying, right? You'd feel kind of cheated. Like, that's not what I signed up for. It sort of feels like maybe I've been paying rent all these years. And that's indeed the problem, right? Back when a drug like Humira is just being developed in clinical trials and investors are investing in it, they never counted on that drug collecting revenues well past its original patents. Therefore, all the money that AbbVie is making today could not be part of the incentive that elicited investors and scientists and everybody come together and invent the drug in the first place, right? So all these extended rents, all of this milking of old drugs actually has nothing to do with incentivizing innovation. And we investors and really all of society, we discount things that are far in the future. And so as an investor, when I build a net present value model and I have to discount future revenues by 8-10% a year, what that means is that revenues that are 16 years and beyond, let's say, from when the drug launches, they kind of barely matter to me today.
Right.
But they do matter to society. Society has a very low cost of capital, a low discount rate. Thankfully so. It means that our government cares about our children and our grandchildren almost as much as it cares about us. That's why it invests in things that might not themselves feel like a good idea for the private sector. It will fund, the development of infrastructure, of roads, and invest in clean water, and invest in alternative energy and basic science, even though no investor can sort of see the money in it. But society can when it looks out decades and decades, even a century, right? And so it invests in that. And so I would argue that society should see these drugs, as long as they're genericizable, as an opportunity to invest in the long-term upgrade of human health, of averting surgeries, averting hospital stays. It's important that those go generic in order to say that you're averting all those costs, and it just needs to offer investors what they value, which is a near-term bolus of reward, the first 10 to 15 years, right? Yeah. So we need a solution to these drugs that turn out, instead of being mortgages, they turn out to be, hey, kiddo. Oh, I'm so sorry. Meet the impetus for the book in part.
We've already talked about you.
Yeah. Kiddo, do you think maybe I can finish my conversation?
Why?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
I almost came too late.
I didn't plan for this. I really do need to finish the conversation. So
but Daddy, I almost came too late. And how long will you be done?
Oh, not too long.
How long?
We'll play later.
How long?
About 30 minutes.
What?
I really hope you can edit this. All right. Yes, we need to prevent our industry from getting addicted to collecting rents and losing that hustle to replace revenues. And that's why I propose contractual genericization. Basically, enter into contracts with these companies and say, you're making a great drug here. I get it. And if it works and we approve it, just register your patents in the Orange Book, as you do. And let's set a date when the mortgage will end, a contractual genericization date. What is it here? Oh, your patents expire after 14 years? Great. That's your date. If you happen to come up with ideas for how to meaningfully upgrade your drug, for example, in the case of Humira, the original drug when it launched, it was really stingy. It was an acidic formulation. And along the way, AbbVie changed it, and they found a way to make it so that it didn't have that acid in it, and so it doesn't sting nearly as much anymore. Now, that's great. That's a drug I want on the generic mountain, in the generic armamentarium for the long run. So if you make that kind of an improvement, we'll extend the contractual genericization date. In the case of Humira, it's generating $15 billion a year. You give AbbVie 6 more months of exclusivity, that's $7.5 billion. That is a lot of incentive to upgrade the drug. And it's exactly the kind of mechanism we use to incentivize companies today to run, for example, a pediatric trial and teach us how can all these drugs that are typically developed for adults be used if we should need to use them for a child, right? So we're capable of saying your drug will go generic, on this date, but if you upgrade it along the way incrementally, we'll simply extend that date by a bit. Not the life of a whole new patent, as AbbVie has essentially done. You don't get to collect an entire new mortgage as if you've just invented a whole new drug from scratch. Just extend it long enough, to incentivize that incremental upgrade. And when you hit your contractual genericization date, you will drop the cost of your drug to slightly more than the cost of production. We will contract with you. America will contract with you to be the supplier of America's public good that you helped us create, right? And that's part of the bargain. You get to collect the mortgage if we are assured that the house really will be intact and continue to provide shelter to our family and our children and our grandchildren for the rest of time. You have to be accountable for the reliability of what we've essentially commissioned from you to create, right? Instead, what do we have? Companies make their branded drug. Then you rely on competition by a bunch of other companies that don't know that drug as well. As Catherine Eben pointed out in her book, Bottle of Lies, some of them really don't know how to make it, so they'd sooner fake the data and pretend it's high quality and they sell us garbage. And you might be getting your generic drug prescription filled with garbage. That's the shocking, revelation in Catherine Eben's book. And the branded companies, I worry, are loving it. And Jeremy Green, medical historian, actually in his review of Catherine's book, even said, "What have you done? By shining a light on the low quality of drugs that are being made in India, you've simply pushed America back into the arms of the branded drug companies. Now every doctor that writes for a prescription of Lipitor is going to have to write, dispense as written, right? And what that means is that the pharmacist will not be able to swap it out with a generic. It's the only way that you can guarantee that you are going to get a well-made drug. You cannot actually say, I'd like to get my drug, my generic drug, from a supplier in Ireland. Can you please hook me up with that? No, the system is not designed for that. The system is designed to say, I'm sorry, I can only fill your prescription with the absolute cheapest generic, whatever that may be. And, not surprisingly, probably every generic drug in your and anybody else's medicine cabinet is made by an Indian company. That's not true. There's probably a few exceptions, but the vast majority are made by Indian generic manufacturers. And the FDA can't really inspect them. It gives them notice. It calls them up, as Catherine Eben pointed out, calls them up and says, would you mind if we came by? Oh, yes, sure, please come on by. We're just going to put up this Potemkin village, making it look like we care about quality, and we'll totally fool you. And you're going to walk away knowing full well you've been fooled. But, you got to sign up for the lie, right? Because the last thing you want to do is let America know that these low prices it's paying for drugs, it's paying for, just garbage, right? Nobody wants to pop that bubble. Well, Catherine Eben did. And it means that we really have to think about how are we going to get reliable generics? How are we going to make sure that all these new drugs we're incentivizing the creation of really do offer us value and remain reliable but inexpensive for the rest of time after their mortgages have been paid off. And that's contractual genericization. That's in the book. I hope Congress reads it. I write articles about it. I've got testimony that I submitted to Congress on the book's website that people can read, linking contractual genericization to how we can repatriate the production of drugs to U.S. soil so that the FDA really can monitor the quality. And we really need that reform. That is and that's kind of the trade that Congress is looking for in order to lower out-of-pocket costs. If you look at the bills like H.R. 3, you realize that they're very much sort of in the spirit of past legislation that, like HatchWaxman says, look, we want to make sure that we get value for drugs, but we're willing to, give you something in return. We're going to, in the case of HatchWaxman, we're going to give you patent term restoration if it took you a long time to develop a drug. So you get to collect your mortgage for a bit longer, but we guarantee that you're going to have a patent cliff. That's what HatchWaxman did. It gave with one hand and it took with another. Or the ACA, Obamacare. It extended insurance to more people, which makes it easier for drug companies to collect their mortgage payments. But it also created the biosimilar pathway,
right,
which isn't really a good way to genericize drugs. It doesn't have good provisions for interchangeability, but it's a start. It's an attempt to end the rent extraction from biologics, right? And so Nancy Pelosi's office submitted this bill, HR 3, where it said, well, we see the problem for patients. Yes, they absolutely need a reduction in out-of-pocket costs, so we're going to legislate that. But we're looking for something to take from the industry. What can we take? And they proposed egregious, destructive price controls on all drugs, or actually 250 of the best-selling drugs, which is to say the engine of the industry, right? And they look to shave $100 billion of America's spending on branded drugs per year, right? So $1 trillion over a decade, and somehow pretended that wouldn't, defund innovation, right? And I looked at that bill and I thought, wow, this is going to be so destructive to innovation. Like, my investors will pull their money from my fund. I won't get to do my job. And all these problems that I can see we have the tools to fix, we're not going to get to actually, implement those solutions. Like,
yeah,
that's a shame. And so HR 3 actually could have worked if you had simply said, look, don't impose price controls on drugs right at the outset when they launch. Just impose them after the patents have expired to guarantee that they go generic. You're looking for a pound of flesh. I get it. There's actually a really great pound of flesh you should be taking from our industry. This emerging rent extraction, model that's emerging. Fix it. Impose legislation to bring about contractual genericization in exchange for lowering out-of-pocket costs for patients. Then you will have solved affordability for patients, and you will have secured value for America while preserving the mortgage streams that are the incentive and fuel for innovation. I'll pause there to drink and breathe.
I know I think it's something that we've pointed out before. I mean, we publish the innovation index every year, and part of that has this freshness index. And one thing that's apparent, if you take the top 30 companies and you look at 2019's revenue, something like 12% of that revenue was derived from drugs they launched in the last 5 years. I mean, this is an average, right? Because you've got Gilead's and you've got some people who are trending higher there. So there is definitely that addiction to old drug revenues. And the case of Humira is a perfect one, right? The next through 23, that's another 60-70 billion dollars of revenue for a 15-16-year-old drug. That's an addiction behavior that actually is maybe counter to the idea.
Over 21 years.
Right.
If indeed Humira goes off of its cliff in 2023 when they've negotiated to allow biosimilars to launch, then it will have been 21 years that we would have paid that mortgage.
Yeah.
Right? That's a long time. But you know what? It's still better than all the pain and suffering from all the autoimmune conditions,
right,
that if people would be suffering if we didn't invent Humira. So the point is, you can solve society's cost. You can bring down society's cost on drugs that are manufactured good. You can't do that with hospitals, or we certainly haven't figured out how to.
Right. And that's actually maybe focusing some of the minutes that we have left is really that positivity that you have around America. Because there's no doubt that our industry has America as its success story, right? I mean, this is the place that our new medicines are coming from. And there's a great line in the book, America pays more for drugs because it remains unwilling to outright deny patients access to treatment on the basis of their ability to pay, which makes the American market a reliable source of funding for the drug industry. So that kind of idea that, sit in the UK, sit in Germany, sit in Scandinavia, they are willing to tell people that they can't have new medicines. But you make the point very well in the book.
Yeah.
America doesn't do that.
But, in part, they're willing to do that because they know that America's there. America continues to support some of the world's most important institutions. And the current administration, which I got a whole lot of issues with, isn't wrong when it points out that other wealthy nations aren't paying their fair share. And this was the problem back in the 70s and 80s with Canada basically ignoring drug patents, right? And NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, brought them in line. We traded with Canada. We offered them something, I'm not sure what, to buy more maple syrup in exchange for them respecting drug patents. And so these are negotiations that have to be had between countries. It's very hard for a drug company to, go up against, the German healthcare system, and negotiate for itself. It's easier to say, look, since we're making enough off of America, just tell us what you're going to pay. Don't make it so insulting that it creates political problems for me in the US, as you've seen, right? And a lot of people saying, how come Europeans are paying less? Just pay me something. Something's better than nothing, right? And it would be great if Europe valued this grand effort that's underway. You can certainly see it on display, to respond to COVID, but and we've got a map on our website of all the technologies that are in development for COVID. People can go to our website and they can download this detailed map. Well, we've got maps like that for breast cancer, for Parkinson's, for rheumatoid arthritis, for diabetes. There's this level of hustle that people see for COVID going on for just about every disease out there, right? And it would be great if other wealthy nations were to support that by being willing to pay higher prices for branded drugs, because they surely enjoy them when they go generic.
Yeah, and you mentioned in the book, it isn't the leverage that a German payer has, or NICE and the NHS in the UK. You made the point. Express Scripts covers more people's lives than Canada or Australia combined. It's so it isn't the presence of a single payer system that's driving down the prices here.
Yeah. So, people say if we just had a single payer system, we'd have more negotiating power. But, America's a big country, and the individual payers that we've got, Blue Cross Blue Shield and, PBMs like Express Scripts, they're negotiating on numbers of people that are larger than, just about any one European country. So if it's just about, group purchasing power, then America would have much lower prices. The bottom line is that drug companies have to fight to preserve high prices in America, because it's the foundation for their very existence. It's the core stream of revenues that keeps this industry going. And if America caves and just imports the sort of approach to valuing drugs that Europe takes, if we import their policy, then we'll be grossly undervaluing these innovations. And the world, when you undervalue something, you get less of it, right? So unfortunately, we do have the rise of organizations like ICER that willfully do myopic math. Willfully, they ignore that a drug goes generic. They've been told they don't care. They exclude this. And it would be like a financial advisor coming to you when you're, paying for your home, paying mortgage payments for your home, and say, I see you're paying $3,000 a month, but Bob down the street's only paying $2,000. You're paying more than Bob. You're overpaying. Really, like, your parents should have a conversation with you about what a dummy you are. Like, you really should not be paying that much. And you say, well, you realize I'm paying a mortgage, and that guy down the street is paying rent. Like, my mortgage will end. And this financial advisor, imagine if you said, what do you mean mortgage versus rent? I'm not familiar with these terms. As far as I'm concerned, it's 3,000 versus 2,000. Like, you'd think that person's, certainly not a qualified financial advisor, right? What do you mean you don't know the difference between mortgage and rent? Well, that's what ICER's doing, right? And of course, America just doesn't see the parallels between mortgage and rent, so it doesn't hold ICER accountable. It just says, well, you're some nonprofit. Yeah, nonprofit, backed by John Arnold, hardcore libertarian, and formerly from Enron, a billionaire who just believes that people need skin in the game or they're not going to stay in good health. So if you got sickle cell disease, maybe if your copays were high enough, you'd somehow solve your own sickle cell disease. Well, I don't subscribe to that, right? And I think that we need to recognize that we have to choose to spend money to incentivize the development of these cures. It's the only way we're going to ultimately rid ourselves of the burden of sickle cell disease, right? Which really, I mean, I love my children so dearly, and I cannot imagine what it's like for families who have to deal with sickle cell disease in their family. We chose to spend $230 billion of using today's dollars to put people on the moon. Like, America is capable of investment in all kinds of stuff, and putting people on the moon did not actually cure any kids of sickle cell disease, right? We just did it because we wanted to be proud of it, and also because the government in its wisdom realized if you can achieve that, you'll develop all kinds of technologies along the way that will be useful to us. So if we can spend that kind of money to put people on the moon, I'd like us to choose the Apollo project of sickle cell disease, the Apollo project of breast cancer, just like we're undertaking the Apollo project of COVID, right? And shelling out huge amounts of money from BARDA and other organizations in order to accelerate the development of vaccines and drugs. We've got the right idea for COVID. Let's keep it up for all these diseases.
Right. And there's a part in the book, respecting your time today as well. When you get to the opioid chapter, I thought, right, this is going to be an interesting test for the case that you just made for innovation, novel formulations and so forth. But the opioid chapter I found incredibly well written, written with depth and passion and insight, which is stuff I didn't know about. The behavior of some of these companies. Could you tell us how the biotech social contract in that chapter especially applies to the kind of opioid crisis that we see in America?
Yeah. So the opioid chapter was actually one of the last that I wrote, and it was in response. Apologies, 1 second. All right. So it was in response to one of my editors saying, you can't write a book about drugs and affordability or anything like that if you don't address opioids and the opioid crisis.
Yeah.
And in my mind, the injustices of the opioid crisis, they weren't really related to affordability per se, but I could see why that he was right, that the reader judges sort of the moral fiber of our industry by things like certainly the EpiPen, which I did address, and of course opioids. And so as I delved into the history of opioids, and which is a long history, I didn't appreciate it. I learned a lot from researching that. I came to see that actually there very much is a linkage between the way that we pay for drugs and the way we incentivize innovation, and the way out of the opioid crisis. And just to give you a sense of it, opioids are generic drugs now. A lot of opioids are. And if we rely on insurance companies to decide how to pay for drugs and to encourage people to use the cheapest drug available, then what you're going to have is kind of what we've had now for years, which is a disincentive to try to develop drugs that could be non-opioids, non-addictive, safer, but that would be more expensive, would have to be more expensive, because we need to know that we can more than just recoup our investment in developing those drugs. Except an insurance company, how does it see the savings exactly of people not getting opioids, of being able to avoid opioids? The vast majority of people who take opioids actually aren't abusing them. They're not addicted, like they're using them properly. those opioids find their way into the hands of other people, or some minority of people who do use opioids do get addicted. And then when their doctor says, well, no, I'm not going to give you opioids anymore, which is pretty much what happened in the last 10 years, those people have to go into the streets to find what they can, and they'll find contaminated products and, God knows what dosage of fentanyl, and they can overdose. So, we absolutely need to make sure that the agents that we entrust to incentivize drug development understand we really want you to reimburse generously any technologies, any drugs that allow us to spare the use of opioids so that we get away from this drug class, right? In 50 years, let's hope that we are not using, any addictive opioids. And I say that because technically speaking, there are opioid-like molecules that, might be non-addictive, but still functionally, let's hope we get away from opioids entirely. Because as much as people have searched for this magical unicorn, the non-addictive opioid, every time we thought we had it, and heroin, by the way, was hailed as a non-addictive opioid back when it was invented. They got that one wrong. And so was OxyContin. The FDA thought OxyContin would be non-addictive, right? I mean, we can laugh at that now, but there were a lot of people that thought that the slower release kinetics of OxyContin would make it less likable and truly like a safe drug, and that when a doctor prescribes OxyContin, don't worry, it is inherently a safe drug. Well, we got that wrong, right? And Purdue loved it, and that is their crime. That even when they had plenty of evidence that said, yeah, this isn't true, they really hammed up the message, and they did everything to promote and exaggerate the safety of their products, right? And that company rightfully was taken down for their crimes, and we need that kind of policing, right? So I'm not going to tell you that drug companies are virtuous.
Right.
Society has to police everybody to make sure that they adhere to their stated values. But we also have to make sure that the agents that we charge with rewarding innovation, insurance companies, are forward-looking enough to understand that while technically it would be cheaper for them for this year's budget to direct a patient to use a generic opioid, that's just the wrong policy. Figure out how to afford these newer drugs that are non-opioid based, and if you have to raise premiums, so be it. Raise premiums and let us pay slightly higher premiums and slightly higher taxes in order to make sure that we're investing where we need to go. Just like paying to put people on the moon raised our taxes a bit, right? But you do not need to make the few patients that are suffering from pain be the ones to pay for these innovations. Just like I don't believe we charge the astronauts, for their trip to the moon.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think you make that point very well in the book that, the people who are sick tend to end up, funding this mortgage for everyone that will benefit in time with this kind of generic drug mountain. Realize we've got maybe a couple of minutes left and really can only direct people to the book for more, and actually what's a remarkably well referenced book as well, so thank you for the diligence there. And something to kind of end on, I think I deeply believe, as you write, that the drug industry should make its money from innovation, not the long tails of profits from all drugs. That was music to my ears. Maybe last question before I let you go and see your daughter. Is there a reading list for you? Is there a kind of book that you feel everyone else should be taking a look at?
So I'll offer up two, and that's Catherine Eben's book, Bottle of Lies. I think that's important. It will cause everybody to stop taking for granted the quality of the generic drugs that are in their medicine cabinet, and hopefully give people an extra reason to think about the merits of contractual genericization so that we can rely on the original manufacturer of a drug without paying them prices as if the drug were new. And then if you're really into the story of this industry and the sort of historic arc, I would recommend Jeremy Green's book, generic, right? It doesn't quite have the thriller, feel that Catherine Eben's book does, but it's actually a really important book, and it taught me a lot.
Phenomenal. I will include both of those in the show notes, and certainly I advise people to go back and take a look at Catherine's interview as well, because that, as I say, is a kind of mind-blowing book. But as you say, not one that we should take as a problem, but one as an opportunity for us to do this differently. So, Peter, thank you so much for your time today. And people want to find out more about you. Is it easy?
I don't think it's too hard. No, I'm on Twitter. I'm on the internet. So
Nice.
look me up.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.